In the quiet corners of history, there are stories not often told, stories shaped by human strength and human failure. This is one of those stories the accounts we share now reach back through time to reveal moments that changed the world. Let us begin by travelling into a past long forgotten yet still echoing into our present. Imagine flooded fields and endless wars alongside the richest trading empire anyone had ever seen. It sounds impossible, a contradiction too great to be real, yet this is the story of the Netherlands, a country built on paradox. For centuries the Dutch fought rival kingdoms and also the sea itself. They carved a home from fragile marshes and shifting rivers. They built dikes to hold back the water. They built ships to rule the oceans. They built cities that amazed the world with wealth and culture. This is a history of survival and ambition. Small provinces stood against mighty empires. A people turned weakness into strength. How could a land under constant threat give us brutal fights for life and great works of art? How did a nation no bigger than a stamp become a global superpower? By the 1st century BCE, Rome pushed north until it reached the great rivers of the north. The Rhine became the line between the empire and the wild lands beyond. This border the Romans called the Limes marked the edge of their world south of the river. Roman governors built forts and towns, pulling the land into their system. North of the river, the empire stopped. This split created a divided land. Roman power met the shifting strength of Germanic tribes. Patterns were set here that would echo for centuries. The southern lands joined the province of Germania. Inferior Rome was more than an army here. It brought administration towns and garrisons and supply depots, tied the region to a larger network. Latin writing imported goods, and Roman coins moved freely, but Roman reach had limits. Beyond the Rhine lay marshes and bogs. Imperial armies found these lands hard to enter. Northern groups lived free in scattered communities, keeping their old traditions. This frontier created a cultural fault line between north and south, a divide that never fully left Dutch history. One tribe stood out along this frontier, the Batavians. They lived in the river delta, a landscape both rich and dangerous. Channels and wetlands protected them from enemies. Rome made a deal with them, self-rule in exchange for military service. This bargain made Batavian communities a reliable source of soldiers for the empire. Roman generals valued these warriors for their discipline and skill. They served far from home in Britain and the East, and even in the Praetorian Guard protecting emperors. This unusual relationship made the Batavians both allies and subjects trusted but watched closely. That trust broke in the year 69 CE. Led by Julius Civilis, the Batavians rose in revolt. They shook the Rhine frontier. They brought in neighbouring tribes and crushed Roman units. They cut supply lines and threatened key cities. For over a year, chaos spread. This coincided with political crisis in Rome itself. Civilis almost created an independent state before Rome recovered its authority. The uprising was among the largest in the western provinces. It failed, but its memory lived on in the delta as proof that imperial power could be challenged. Even through conflict, Rome left lasting marks. Engineers built roads through the lands linking forts called castella that guarded river crossings. They dug canals to move goods and troops more easily. At Nijmegen or Novia Megas, a large settlement grew. Today we know it as the oldest city in the Netherlands. Archaeological finds show imported pottery, military gear and signs of cosmopolitan life, reaching into once swampy isolation. Life on the frontier required small adaptations. Roman soldiers in the cold, damp climate often wore socks inside their sandals. Archaeologists found footwear with traces of fabric stuffing, a practical adjustment we rarely picture with classical legions. Another sign of their presence, the line of forts they built is so well preserved that in 2021 the Lower Germanic Limes joined the UNESCO World Heritage List. These remains show Rome's will to secure its edge even in hard terrain. When imperial power faded in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the frontier dissolved. Garrisons left. Towns shrank. The divide between Roman south and tribal north widened again, but Rome did not vanish completely. Traditions of law building and military organisation mixed with Germanic ways of life. From that blend grew a cultural foundation for later Dutch society. When Roman legions left the Rhine frontier in the 5th century, the Low Countries had no strong central authority. Old fortified towns and military camps fell into decay. Wide river valleys and coastal marshes became ground contested by new powers. Into this empty space stepped Germanic groups. Their language, culture and shifting alliances would shape the region for centuries. First came the Frisians. They controlled the windswept coasts from the modern northern Netherlands into northwest Germany. Their home was harsh but rich for those who mastered the sea. Salt marshes gave grazing land, shallow waters sheltered fishing grounds. Frisians became known as skilled traders and seafarers. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Frisian merchants were regulars at markets along the North Sea and English Channel. They made contacts as far as Britain and Scandinavia. Their ships made them mobile and raiding was as common as trade. They're often compared to the later Vikings, though their sea tradition came generations before the longship raids. South of this coastal world, the Franks grew from a cluster of tribes into a strong kingdom. They first rose under the Merovingian dynasty. By the 6th century, they were a dominant power in northern Gaul. Their leaders spread influence into the southern Netherlands through conquest and alliances. They slowly pulled the fertile river valleys into their growing realm. With the rise of the Carolingian dynasty in the 8th century, the Frankish state became an empire. It sought not just political control, but religious unity. This authority reached across much of Western Europe, including lands that would form the Netherlands to the east in the woodland, uplands and rivers. Saxon groups contested territory with both Frisians and the expanding Franks. Their society was less centralised, built on kinship ties, and war leaders' tensions between these Saxon bands and their neighbours led to centuries of fights. This was especially true as Frankish rulers tried to spread Christian influence into still pagan regions. The eastern borders of the Netherlands became zones of frequent turmoil, a patchwork of unsteady alliances. One figure came to symbolise resistance in this landscape, King Redbad, also known as Radbard, ruling the Frisian kingdom in the late 7th and early 8th centuries. He stood against Frankish power and rejected Christian missionaries' sources. From the time, call him a defender of the old gods and a determined opponent of submission to the south. His armies clashed with Frankish forces repeatedly until he was finally overcome by Charles Martel. That Frankish leader, remembered for stopping the spread of Islam into Europe, also pushed north against the Frisians. He forced their elites to submit and arrange the baptism of their people. Missionaries were central to this process of integration. Figures like St. Willibrord established bishoprics and worked to root Christianity in the northern provinces. Another missionary, Boniface, met a dramatic end in 754. While travelling near Dockham to preach, he and his followers were ambushed by local opponents and killed. This event was remembered as a martyrdom, a symbol of the fierce resistance missionaries faced in the region. Legends about Redbad show this clash of faiths. He is said to have refused baptism after learning his pagan ancestors would go to hell. He remarked he would rather stay with them than enter heaven with his enemies. True or not, the story shows how deeply identity and belief were tied in this era. Language also shows continuity. From this time, modern Dutch and Frisian are among the closest relatives of English. This reflects shared roots linking Frisians and Saxons with settlers of early medieval Britain. In this way, the North Sea was less a barrier and more a bridge, fostering family ties and cultural exchange. When the Carolingian Empire broke apart in the 9th and 10th centuries, its authority in the Low Countries collapsed. What remained was a patchwork of territories reflecting local power, not imperial unity. Great lords, bishops and counts built castles, issued laws and collected taxes across their fragmented lands. This was no single kingdom, but a mosaic of smaller ones, each with its own dreams. From this environment rose the political forces that would dominate medieval Dutch history. The County of Holland on the western coast, the Duchy of Brabant inland, the County of Flanders in the south. The Bishopric of Utrecht in the north-central region borders often overlapped disputes were common, alliances shifted constantly. The political map never stayed still for long. This fragmentation had consequences. It stopped any one dynasty from dominating the Low Countries completely. But it also allowed a culture of autonomy in towns and pockets of local authority. Merchants and guilds gained from this balance. They won influence where rulers needed their taxes and military support. In practice, this system encouraged negotiation between rulers and subjects. An early form of representative politics grew. Here, city councils and estate assemblies protected urban interests. This style of politics, based on talk and deal-making, became a lasting feature of Dutch governance. Among the rising powers, the Counts of Holland played a key role. Their domain began as a small coastal territory, always threatened by flooding seas and rival neighbours. Over centuries through war, diplomacy and smart marriages, the counts extended their reach. The most famous was Floris in the 13th century. He secured new lands, strengthened peasants against noble abuses, and won a reputation as a protector. Floris became so popular, some called him the peasant's god, but his popularity made him dangerous to aristocratic rivals. In 1296 he was betrayed and murdered while in captivity, an event that shocked his subjects and became a defining moment for Holland. While political rivalries shaped the land, the economy of the Low Countries soared. Wool from England fueled a huge textile industry in Flemish towns, especially Bruges and Ghent. Their factories and workshops made cloth sold across Europe, creating fortunes for merchants and workers. Coastal trade routes linked Baltic grain to Mediterranean goods. Making the region a hub of exchange, Flanders turned into one of Europe's wealthiest centres. Its riches showed in fortified cities, stone churches and busy markets. At the same time, the church kept great secular control in some areas. In the Bishopric of Utrecht, bishops were both spiritual leaders and territorial princes. They commanded armies, collected revenues and governed lands. This dual role blended religious and political authority. It often brought them into conflict with neighbouring nobles. These bishops remind us that feudal Europe did not separate sacred and secular power neatly. The Netherlands was no exception. One sign of how towns asserted themselves is found at Dordrecht. In 1220 it became the first city in the modern Netherlands to get official city rights. These rights were more than symbolic. They allowed the building of walls, the holding of regular markets and the minting of local coins. A community with rights had independence from feudal lords. It could protect its wealth and have a greater say in its governance. Such privileges turned towns into powerful institutions in their own right. They often balanced noble and church authority. By the 14th century, the Low Countries had one of the most densely urban societies in Europe. More people lived in towns than in the countryside, a striking contrast to most of the continent. This urban focus showed how deeply commerce, trade and labour were woven into daily life. Conditions here were centuries ahead of the rural dominance seen elsewhere in Europe. In the late 14th century, a new power rose to dominate the Low Countries. The House of Valois-Burgundy, a branch of the French royal family, began to expand across the lands we now know as Belgium and the Netherlands. Unlike the fragmented map of counties and duchies, the Burgundian dukes used inheritance purchase and smart marriage to stitch together territories never before governed as one. Their success created a turning point. They drew the patchwork of towns and lordships into something like a larger state. It started with Philip the Bold, youngest son of the French king. He married Margaret of Flanders in 1369. Margaret was a powerful heir whose dowry brought immense wealth and key territories at the heart of Europe's trade networks. Through this marriage, Philip gained control over Flanders, Brabant, Hainaut, and later Holland, Zeeland, and Utrecht. Once fiercely independent counties now shared a single dynasty. By the mid-15th century, the Burgundian dukes ruled nearly all the Low Countries called the Burgundian Netherlands. For the first time, one dynasty held sway across north and south. A de facto unified state was born. Among Burgundian rulers, Philip the Good left the deepest mark. His reign lasted over 40 years. In that time, he pursued expansion and centralisation. Under him, the States General assembled a body bringing together delegates from towns and provinces designed to strengthen the Duke's power. It started a tradition of collective politics that lasted long after Burgundian rule ended. Ideas of negotiation, consensus, and representation took root in regional governance. This foreshadowed the role of representative institutions in the Netherlands centuries later. Economically, the Burgundian era brought great prosperity. Towns like Bruges, Ghent, and Brussels stood at the crossroads of European trade. Linked by canals, rivers, and roads, they connected merchants to markets as far as Italy, and the Baltic Bruges especially rose as the financial capital of Northern Europe. It attracted bankers from Florence and Genoa alongside German and English traders. Markets overflowed with English wool feeding a thriving textile industry. Flemish cloth was exported far and wide. The mix of French chivalric culture with the hard-headed habits of Dutch and Flemish merchants made these towns glittering economic centres unmatched in Northern Europe. Then, the Burgundian court also fostered a cultural golden age. Lavish tournaments and banquets displayed wealth and political power. But the influence went beyond pageantry. Music flourished and visual arts reached international audiences. Painters like Jan van Eyck pioneered oil painting techniques, giving startling realism to portraits and religious works. Their style shaped European art for generations, putting Flemish artists at the forefront of innovation. One banquet by Philip the Good became legend for offering over 100 different birds to guests from peacocks to swans, a display meant to stun rival courts with pure extravagance. The wealth flowing into these lands was extraordinary. By the mid-15th century, tax revenues from Ghent and Bruges alone surpassed those of entire established kingdoms. At times, the Burgundian dukes commanded more resources than the King of France himself. A remarkable shift given their start as a junior branch of the royal family. Yet this wealth brought risks. Concentrated power and spending created pressures. It pushed the dukes into conflicts with neighbours and strained the loyalty of their subjects. The dramatic climax came in 1477. Charles the Bold, the last great Burgundian duke, was killed in battle, trying to expand his territories. His sudden death left his daughter Mary of Burgundy as heir to a vast but vulnerable domain. To secure her position, she married Maximilian of Habsburg, heir to another powerful dynasty. That union shifted the Netherlands from French to Habsburg influence. A new chapter of foreign rule began, one that would shape the coming centuries. When Charles the Bold fell in battle in 1477, his dream of a Burgundian kingdom died with him. His daughter Mary of Burgundy suddenly became the most desired heir in Europe. She controlled territories across the wealthy Low Countries. To secure her inheritance, she married Maximilian of Habsburg, the future Emperor Maximilian. First, with this marriage, the Burgundian Netherlands passed into the Habsburg orbit. It tied the region to one of Europe's most powerful families. A union born from necessity would transform the Netherlands for centuries. Their grandson, Charles V, inherited a collection of crowns that made him the mightiest monarch of his age. Born in Ghent in 1500, he would rule Spain and its American colonies, Austria and its Alpine lands, the Netherlands, and hold authority over the Holy Roman Empire. His dominion was so wide, people said the sun never set on it. Despite his vast realm, Charles felt a connection to the Netherlands. He grew up with Dutch-speaking courtiers, learned local tongues, and kept a personal identity tied to his birthplace. But this sense of belonging did not stop him demanding huge resources from the provinces to fund his endless wars. The 16th century brought constant conflict. Charles fought France, the Ottoman Empire, and Protestant princes in Germany. To pay for these campaigns, the Netherlands faced heavy taxes. Their rich cities, buzzing with international trade, provided crucial revenue. Beyond taxes, Charles wanted to reorganise his scattered lands more systematically. In 1549, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, a sweeping measure that legally united the 17 provinces of the Low Countries. Each region kept its traditions, but the sanction framed them as a single political entity destined to pass together to his heirs. This act forged an early sense of unity, but also concentrated power in Habsburg hands. It undermined local autonomy that towns and estates had long defended. Religious change deepened discontent. As the Reformation spread, Calvinist communities sprang up across several provinces. Charles stayed committed to Catholic orthodoxy and launched persecutions against Protestants. Local authorities enforced edicts requiring conformity. Executions marked public punishment for heresy. For a society used to some debate and negotiation, such rigid enforcement caused alarm. Economic grievance, political centralisation, and religious oppression formed a dangerous mix. It loosened loyalty between the Netherlands and their Habsburg ruler. When Charles abdicated in 1555, weary from decades of war, he gave his inheritance to his son Philip II of Spain. Unlike his father, Philip had no close ties to the Low Countries. He grew up in Castile, spoke little of the local languages, and ruled from afar. His governing style leaned toward authoritarianism with little patience for negotiation, to Dutch provinces already straining under heavy burdens. Philip's distant, rigid approach deepened alienation. Enforcement of religious conformity hardened during his reign, speeding resentment. The Habsburg dynasty itself had strange habits that hinted at its decline. Determined to keep their bloodline pure, they repeatedly married close relatives. One striking example, Philip II married his own niece. This cycle of inbreeding led to widespread genetic disorders in later Spanish royals. Such obsession with dynastic purity clashed with the pragmatic approach of the merchant towns they ruled, where alliances shifted easily for advantage. At its peak under Charles V, the Habsburg Empire covered nearly a quarter of the world's people and land, but such vast holdings needed endless resources to defend, supply, and administer. The Netherlands' wealthy, though small, ended up giving disproportionately to this imperial machine. As their tax burdens grew and autonomy shrank, unrest simmered more intensely. By the time Philip II asserted his authority, dissatisfaction had moved past grumbling into open opposition. Tensions sharpened by faith. Finance and political identity set the stage for one of Europe's great uprisings, the Dutch Revolt. By the 1560s, frustration in the Netherlands reached a breaking point. Philip II of Spain governed the 17 provinces with little regard for their traditions of negotiation and local control. Heavy taxes drained the wealth of cities among the richest in Europe. Enforcement of Catholic orthodoxy punished those who turned Protestant. Local nobles feared their authority was being stripped as royal officials, and Spanish troops tightened control. Towns proud of centuries of independence now saw their liberties under threat. Together, these pressures created a society ready for confrontation. The spark came in 1566, an explosion of anger called the Beelden Storm, or iconoclastic fury. crowds of Protestant sympathisers, often joined by ordinary townsfolk, stormed churches across the provinces. Statues of saints were smashed, altars torn down, stained glass shattered. For participants, it was an act of religious defiance, a rejection of a corrupt Catholic hierarchy. For the Spanish crown and loyal Catholics, it was an intolerable insult. The destruction left hundreds of churches ruined. It showed that resistance to Spanish rule could no longer be ignored. Philip II responded with overwhelming force. He sent one of his most feared commanders, the Duke of Alba, to restore order. Arriving in 1567 with a hardened army, Alba imposed terror quickly. He set up a tribunal called the Council of Troubles, dubbed the Council of Blood. By the Dutch, thousands were tried, many executed as suspected rebels or heretics. Confiscations, mass arrests, and brutal punishments turned whole communities against the crown instead of restoring order. Alba's methods deepened the simmering resentment. In this crisis, William of Orange, also called William the Silent, stepped forward. Born into nobility, he had served Philip II as a loyal administrator, even trying to negotiate between king and subjects. Over time, he saw compromise was impossible. William positioned himself as a leader who could unite Protestants and moderate Catholics against Spanish tyranny. He turned from diplomat to strategist, organising resistance that bloomed into full revolt as fighting dragged on. The provinces saw the need for a lasting alliance. In 1579, 7 northern provinces signed the Union of Utrecht. The treaty bound them together in military defence and political cooperation. The war was far from over, but the union is seen as the moment a Dutch identity began to crystallise. It marked a shift from scattered uprisings to a coordinated movement that could stand against one of the era's greatest powers. Though conflict did not end immediately, Spanish control in the north weakened steadily. The revolt fractured the unity of Philip's empire and showed the will of a small, resourceful people to protect both faith and freedom. By the late 16th century, the northern provinces had carved out a position Spain could never fully reverse. What emerged was the foundation of a new kind of state, small, rebellious and fiercely independent. In 1581, several Dutch provinces made a proclamation formally cutting ties with King Philip II of Spain, known as the Act of Abjuration. This document was more than a rebellion. It was a direct rejection of monarchy as an unquestioned institution. The provinces declared that if a ruler failed his duties and oppressed his subjects, he lost any right to govern them. This argument was radical for the 16th century, when kings were believed to rule by divine right. In effect, it advanced an early theory of government linking legitimacy not to lineage, but to the consent and welfare of the people. Declaring independence was one thing, making it work another. At first, the provinces looked for outside rulers to replace Philip. Some approached Elizabeth of England, who gave military support but declined a crown. Others courted the Duke of Anjou, brother to the French king. Both experiments failed, leaving the provinces without a clear sovereign. The failures revealed something new. They didn't need a foreign prince. Years of conflict had forced them to cooperate in military and political matters, so self-governance became a natural solution. By 1588, the provinces solidified this experiment, forming the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands. In an age of kings and dynasties, this was astonishing. The Republic was a federation, not a centralised state. Each province kept its own autonomy with its own laws and customs, but they came together through a collective States General to handle war diplomacy and finance. This system was not efficient by modern standards, but it reflected the long Dutch tradition of negotiation and compromise. Powers was shared, not imposed from above. Religion played a key role in shaping this new republic. Calvinism dominated many northern provinces. Yet the republic did not enforce strict uniformity. While Catholics faced restrictions, there was space for religious minorities, including Mennonites, Lutherans, and later Jewish refugees, to find shelter. This openness relative to neighbours gave the Republic a reputation for tolerance. It attracted waves of immigrants who brought wealth, skills, and networks that enriched Dutch society. Refugee artisans and traders from across Europe built communities in cities like Amsterdam, Leiden, and Rotterdam, turning them into hubs of innovation. Commerce joined tolerance as a cornerstone. Freed from Spain's heavy taxes and free to chart their own policy, the Dutch prioritized trade. They built fleets, sailing the Baltic for grain, the Atlantic for fish, and beyond for spices and textiles. The Republic grew quickly into one of Europe's economic engines. Its ports and shipyards linked markets from the Indies to the Americas. That this growth happened while still at war with Spain showed the resilience of the new state. Formal international recognition, however, was slow. Spain refused to accept defeat for decades. Only in 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia, ending the 30 Years' War, was Dutch independence officially accepted by other European powers. The Republic had fought and endured nearly 80 years before gaining clear acknowledgement of its sovereignty. The Act of Abrogation is now seen as a predecessor to later declarations of independence written almost 2 centuries before the United States issued its own. Its language about rulers losing legitimacy influenced early Enlightenment ideas of the social contract. Equally remarkable, a small republic not only survived constant wars against one of the richest empires of its age, but thrived. Independence was not just survival. It began a new order based on trade, tolerance, and representative governance, a model of modernity for centuries to come. In 1602, the Dutch Republic made a decision reshaping its economy and global trade. Rival trading groups competing for Asia's lucrative spice markets merged into a single entity, the United East India Company, or VOC. The new company got a monopoly on Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Malacca. With this charter, the VOC became the world's first multinational corporation. Cities and investors could buy shares, and for the first time ordinary people could buy and sell pieces of a company on a formal exchange. Modern capitalism with shareholders and corporate governance began in Amsterdam with this institution. The scale of VOC operations was staggering for the time. Fleets of sturdy Dutch ships crossed thousands of miles to reach eastern markets. They went to the islands of Indonesia, the ports of India, the harbors of China, and sometimes as far as Persia. Cargo brought back to Europe included pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, silk, tea, and Chinese porcelain. These goods enriched shareholders and flooded European consumers with luxuries once rare. Amsterdam became a hub where products from distant markets were collected, priced, and resold across the continent. The company's ambitions went far beyond trade. From its earliest voyages, the VOC sought to control strategic points along the sea route. In 1619, it established Batavia, on the site of modern Jakarta, as its Asian headquarters. Dutch forces drove out local rulers and made the city a fortified administrative centre. Batavia became the heart of a growing empire of ports, plantations, and garrisons. Through military campaigns and alliances, the VOC extended control over key spots in the Indonesian archipelago and beyond. What began as trading voyages turned into colonial rule, with the company acting as a state within a state. Its unique charter granted powers normally reserved for governments. The VOC could build forts, mint coins, negotiate treaties with Asian rulers, and when needed wage war. These privileges gave company officials enormous influence. A private corporation could command armies and dictate terms overseas without direct orders from the Dutch Republic. The company is not remembered only for commercial success. It enforced control with ruthless methods. Dutch commanders imposed strict monopolies on spice production, destroying crops outside their control to keep European prices high. Resistance met violence. In 1621, in the Banda Islands, VOC forces massacred much of the population after local leaders resisted, giving exclusive nutmeg rights. Survivors were enslaved or expelled, the islands repopulated with foreign labour under Dutch watch. Such events showed the darker side of corporate empire, building where profit came before human cost. The immense wealth from these ventures is hard to imagine. During the 1632, the VOC's market value, adjusted to modern terms, exceeded that of today's largest corporations combined. It stands as the most valuable company in recorded history. Wealth brought unusual opportunities. In Japan, where foreign contact was tightly restricted, the Dutch gained a unique position from their small trading post on the artificial island of Dreamy. They were the only Europeans allowed to stay through Japan's long isolation. For over 2 centuries, the Dutch kept this window into a closed society, trading porcelain, silver and Western science knowledge for Japanese goods. By the 18th century, corruption and inefficiency weakened the company. Competition from other European powers grew, while administering far-off colonies became costlier. In 1799, after nearly 2 centuries, the VOC was dissolved. Yet by then, it had changed Dutch history. It catapulted a small republic into the ranks of global economic superpowers. It also left a legacy of exploitation and colonial domination in Asia that would echo for generations. The 17th century is the Dutch Golden Age, a time when the small republic at Europe's edge became the world's leading maritime and commercial power. Dutch ships sailed every ocean, delivering goods to markets in Amsterdam and Rotterdam and exporting European products to distant lands. While Spain and Portugal opened the first ocean routes in the previous century, the Dutch perfected their use for sustained, systematic trade. Their dominance was not just about numbers. It came from deep mastery of naval technology, organization and geography, giving them a lasting advantage. By mid-century, the Dutch had the largest merchant fleet anywhere. Records show thousands of ships under their flag, moving grain, timber and fish across the Baltic, carrying spices and textiles from Asia, transporting enslaved Africans and plantation crops across the Atlantic, and circulating silver and goods throughout Europe. No other European state matched the scale or efficiency of this network. The sea was so central to life, it reached every corner of Dutch society, creating jobs not just for sailors and soldiers, but for builders, map makers and dock workers. By some estimates, 1 in 10 Dutchmen was directly involved in navigation or maritime trade, a proportion unmatched elsewhere in Europe then. Central to this success was shipbuilding innovation. Dutch shipwrights introduced the Fluwite cargo vessel that revolutionized sea commerce. Unlike heavy warships, the Fluwite was built for volume and economy. Its design needed smaller crews and carried more cargo, letting Dutch merchants transport goods at far lower cost than rivals. With this came better charts and navigation. Dutch geographers made detailed maps of coastlines, sea routes and wind patterns, giving sailors reliable tools for global journeys. These innovations gave the Republic a commercial edge for decades. While the East India Company dominated Asian trade, the Atlantic needed another instrument. In 1621, the Dutch West India Company formed to compete with Spanish and Portuguese influence. Its role was many-sided: to set up colonies in the Caribbean and the Americas, to intercept enemy shipping, and to manage the growing trade of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The company founded New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, planted colonies in Suriname and Curaçao, and took key territories like the Cape Colony in southern Africa. Through these footholds, Dutch ships could dominate transoceanic routes, refuel and carry goods back to Europe. At the same time, piracy against enemy nations became routine, with Dutch privateers seizing valuable cargo and weakening Spain's empire. Naval power was not just commercial. The Republic fought a series of wars with England and Spain, where admirals like Michael de Ruyter won lasting fame. Dutch fleets often outnumbered, won remarkable victories using superior maneuver and discipline. One dramatic episode came in 1667, when Dutch squadrons sailed up the River Thames into the English heartland. They even captured the flagship Royal Charles, towing it back to the Netherlands as a trophy. The ship's carved stern plate still sits in an Amsterdam museum, a reminder of that bold victory. This time of success laid foundations for a global influence lasting centuries, but dominance brought conflict. Rivalries with England, France and Spain meant prosperity came with near constant war. The very innovations that made the Dutch powerful drew envy and hostility from other states eager for a share of global wealth. The Dutch Golden Age is remembered for trade and naval strength, but the 17th century stands out just as much for culture and thought. With new wealth arriving from every corner of the globe, society shifted in a way rare in Europe then. Instead of palaces and churches as the main patrons of artists and thinkers, it was now the urban middle class, merchants, artisans, and well-off citizens who commissioned works. That change produced a different kind of art, one reflecting not kings and saints, but the everyday life of households, the pride of guilds, and the confidence of a prosperous republic. This explains why cities like Amsterdam, Haarlem, and Delft filled with painters producing on a scale the world had never seen. Rembrandt focused on psychological stories with dramatic light and shadow, capturing human struggle in faces and gestures. Vermeer turned inward, painting quiet interiors, studying simple domestic scenes with amazing attention to detail and light. Hals showed lively portraits, breaststroke quick and full of motion. Judith L. Eyster, one of the few celebrated female painters of the time, gained success with vivid works of music making figures and smiling children. John Steen, known for playful, sometimes chaotic scenes, depicted daily life with humor and wit. Together these painters changed how people saw art. They made it something households could hang in a living room, not just sacred images for cathedrals. This was the century landscapes became their own genre, reflecting the pride Dutch citizens felt in the polders, canals and windmills that made life in their watery land possible. Still life showed tables crowded with fruit shells, books or musical instruments, each chosen to symbolize wealth, knowledge, or life's fleeting nature. Portraits celebrated local militias, civic leaders and family life, subjects rooted firmly in the world around them, not distant scripture. At the height of this boom, the Netherlands had only about 2 million people. Yet artists produced over 1 million paintings that century alone. While canvases filled walls, new discoveries filled books. The Netherlands became a center of the scientific revolution. Antony van Leeuwenhoek used microscopes. He crafted himself to see tiny organisms never seen before. With them he discovered bacteria and protists, earning recognition as the father of microbiology. Christian Huygens worked across fields, contributing to physics, astronomy and practical technology. He invented the pendulum clock, the most accurate timekeeper of its age, and discovered Titan, one of Saturn's moons. Such work flourished because the Dutch Republic protected freedoms not common elsewhere in Europe. Ideas spread widely and many scholars saw the Netherlands as the safest place to publish controversial works. Philosophers like Baruch Spinoza found space to write and challenge ideas about religion and government in a century when others risked prison or exile for such writing. Publishing houses made books at a scale unmatched for population size. By the late 1600s, the Netherlands printed more books per person than any country in Europe, making it the continent's publishing capital. The vitality of this intellectual and artistic world did not exist apart from commerce. It was tied directly to global trade, shipped home and spices, silks, porcelain and profits. Merchants reinvested that wealth not just in ships and warehouses, but in canvases, instruments and books. In that mix of worldly exchange and local creativity emerged a society, both prosperous in goods and rich in ideas, a combination unique to the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. In the 17th century, Amsterdam grew into the center of world finance. This change did not happen overnight. It came from decades of trading voyages bringing goods from Asia, Africa and the Americas into Dutch harbors. As wealth from the Dutch East India Company and other ventures poured into the city, merchants needed a place to store money safely and manage investments on a larger scale than ever. From those needs, Amsterdam created tools that still shape finance today. The most important was the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Founded in 1602, it was the world's first official marketplace for shares. Its first listings were bonds and stocks of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. This let merchants, artisans, and even ordinary citizens buy a piece of the company. Profit no longer required owning ships or taking personal risks at sea. Anyone with savings could invest in worldwide trade and get dividends when voyages succeeded. Speculation quickly spread and investors bought and sold shares to profit not just from trade, but from shifts in demand and expectation. The Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609, added another layer of trust to this system. Before the bank, European trade used coins of unreliable purity and weight, creating confusion from city to city. The Bank of Amsterdam offered stable currency, exchange, clear accounting, and the promise deposits kept their value. International merchants who never visited the city began directing accounts through Amsterdam, confident the new system would protect their money. This reliability made the Dutch Republic a magnet for foreign business. Amsterdam traders kept experimenting with financial tools. They pioneered futures contracts, letting a buyer lock in a commodity purchase for a later date, and options, offering the chance to buy or sell shares based on future prices. Short selling, another Dutch creation, let traders profit from falling values, even without owning the asset. What these tools shared was a move away from physical goods toward trading potential gains. The modern stock market, with its complex strategies and risks, began here on the city's exchange floor. Money from this financial system reached far beyond business. It helped pay for wars, protecting Dutch independence, built the canals and port works, shaping Amsterdam's landscape, and supported scholars and inventors, pushing scientific boundaries. Investors sometimes got returns not as currency, but as goods, including spices, like cloves and nutmeg, when the company's cash ran low. Even this showed the link between material trade and emerging financial system. By the mid-17th century, investors from Venice, London, Istanbul traveled to Amsterdam for the exchange. Many did not even speak Dutch, but translation mattered less than the profits in this remarkably advanced marketplace. With these developments, Amsterdam became the Wall Street of its era. Its innovations would ripple outward, influencing London, Paris, and eventually financial centers on every continent. Rival empires would challenge Dutch strength at sea, but the city's invention of modern finance remains one of its most lasting legacies. The Dutch Republic's amazing rise in global trade and finance meant it would not stay unchallenged. Its ships moved more goods than any other fleet. Its banking system stabilized currencies across Europe, and its colonies spanned oceans. With so much influence in a small republic, powerful neighbors began to push back. England and France, the two other emerging giants of the 17th century, saw Dutch wealth as direct competition. The stage was set for costly fights that would slowly weaken Dutch dominance. The most direct struggles were the Anglo-Dutch Wars, fought between 1652 and 1674. These were 3 straight campaigns, each aiming to control trade routes, colonial markets, and naval power. The English navy tried to take maritime commerce from the Dutch, and the Dutch answered with resolve. Victories were not one-sided. Both sides claimed triumphs in different battles. But one moment showed Dutch daring. In 1667, Admiral Michael de Ruyter led a fleet up the River Medway, striking deep into English waters, burning ships and towing the English flagship home. While celebrated as bold success, the wars over all drained resources disrupted trade and showed the limits of constant conflict against a larger rival. If clashes with England tested resilience, the threat from France nearly destroyed the Republic. In 1670, to a year forever, called the Rampjaar or Disaster Year, Louis IV invaded with overwhelming force. At the same time, England, Munster and Cologne also pressed Dutch borders, hoping to carve up the Republic. What followed was near collapse. Cities braced for occupation raid, almost stopped panic spread. In an extraordinary defense, the Dutch opened dikes, flooding wide stretches of their own countryside, turning land into shallow seas, drowning advancing French cavalry and halting further attacks. This desperate move reflected a larger truth. Water, always a threat to Dutch survival, could also be a weapon of national defense. Amid these military struggles, the Republic faced internal divisions weakening its ability to act. Political factions long split between the Orangists favoring strong leadership under the hereditary stadholders of the House of Orangen, the Republicans oft unwealthy merchant families resisting monarch Superpower and supporting decentralized government. When external crises hit, these disagreements fed instability. Leaders debated not just strategy, but the Republic's very identity. Should it be a federation led by merchants or a monarchy anchored by one figure? Adding to the vulnerability, Dutch innovations no longer stayed unmatched. Ship designs that once gave unrivaled merchant fleets were copied abroad. Other countries recruited Dutch craftsmen to bring those skills home. England and France both built strong navies, improved their financial systems and expanded their own colonies. Slowly the edge once held by the Republic vanished and the balance of power in Europe shifted. One leader rose in this turbulent time, briefly asserting Dutch importance abroad. William I of Orange rose not just to national leadership, but through the glorious revolution of 1688 became King of England, alongside his wife Mary. This gave the Dutch Republic an extraordinary link to the English crown and created strong alliances against France. Diplomatically, this was a high point, but practically, it pulled Dutch attention toward English interests, redirecting resources that might have kept their independent strength. Curiously, even as wars raged, Dutch shipyards stayed so efficient rival nations often hired their workers or studied the designs to improve their own fleets. This paradox showed an irony of power. Dutch expertise was admired, even by enemies fighting them at sea. At their territorial peak, the Republic held more overseas possessions than any power stretching across Asia, Africa and the Americas. But keeping forts, trade posts and fleets in distant waters needed a flow of money and manpower, increasingly straining the small republic. The French Revolution swept Europe in the late 18th century, and in 1795 French troops marched into the Low Countries, replacing the Dutch Republic with the Batavian Republic, a client state of revolutionary France. For almost 2 decades, Dutch institutions were shaped by French rule. Napoleon reorganized administration, imposed new legal systems, and briefly ruled the Netherlands directly when his brother Louis Bonaparte was made King of the Kingdom of Holland in 1806. When Napoleon annexed the country in 1810, Dutch life was tied to his empire, until its fall in 1813 when French troops left. After Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna united the northern and southern provinces under King William I, creating the Kingdom of the Netherlands. This meant one monarch, overseeing both the modern Netherlands and Belgium, a union that would collapse within 15 years. The early 19th century was a time of change as the new kingdom sought stability after years of war. By the 1822, groundwork for economic change was laid. Industrialization, already transforming Britain and spreading into Belgium and Germany, was slower in the Netherlands. The country long relied on overseas trade, seafaring and agriculture, so there was less urgency to modernize factories. Another barrier was a lack of rich coal deposits, making engines of early industrial technology costlier to run. While neighboring Belgium quickly became one of Europe's first industrial economies, the North moved at a steadier pace, focus where trade and transport still gave an advantage. Textiles emerged as an early production center, especially in Twente, where mechanization slowly replaced traditional weaving. Shipbuilding also stayed key, with Dutch yards adapting to steam power, along skill in wooden vessels. The 19th century also saw chemical industries rise, making fertilizers, dyes and later industrial chemicals for manufacturing. By the late century, a new wave of innovation brought electrical engineering forward, with firms like Philips, founded in 1891, starting as small light bulb producers before growing into multinational powerhouses. These industries slowly diversified the economy, reducing reliance on trade alone. Infrastructure grew fast in this period. Railways cut through the country, linking inland cities to the ports of Amsterdam and Rotterdam. Canals, some over 2 centuries old, were modernized to handle steam-powered vessels. Steamships themselves transformed sea commerce, cutting journey times and increasing the volume and regularity of goods moved. As a result, ports became the lifeblood of industrial progress. Rotterdam especially grew with relentless speed in the 19th century, its later position as the world's busiest port tracing back to this age of industrial expansion. With industrial growth came social change. Rural people moved to factory towns, creating a new working class. Conditions in these urban neighborhoods were often harsh, with overcrowded housing, pollution, and low wages shaping daily life. These divides between industrial workers and wealthier citizens sparked the start of socialist politics and labor movements demanding better treatment. Alongside these social tensions came pillarization, a distinct part of Dutch society. Communities organized along ideological and religious lines. Protestant, Catholic, socialist, and liberal groups each made their own newspapers, schools, labor unions, and even sports clubs. This division gave stability in a fragmented society, but also reinforced separation between communities. By 1900, the Netherlands combined centuries of land reclamation skill with new engineering to create one of the world's most advanced water management systems. This capacity peaked in projects like the Zuiderzee works, aiming to turn sea into fertile polder land. These remarkable efforts showed how old traditions of controlling water were carried into the industrial age with modern method. The slow industrialization of the 19th century did more than improve the economy. It reshaped Dutch identity, encouraged new political movements, and prepared the foundations of the welfare state. Institutions defining modern society, social democracy, organized labor, and state planning trace origins to this time, when factories, ports, and new technologies began to dominate the Dutch landscape. In 1815, after Napoleon fell, the Congress of Vienna drew Europe's map to restore balance between great powers. One key decision created the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. This new state merged the Protestant northern provinces, roughly the modern Netherlands, with the Catholic southern provinces, which would become modern Belgium. The goal was a strong buffer state on France's northern frontier, preventing another French expansion into Europe's heart. The new kingdom went to King William I of the House of Orange, who ruled both communities as one monarchy, though unity was more imagined than written. From the start, deep divisions marked the union. In the north, Protestantism shaped society, politics, and authority. The south kept a strong Catholic identity. Religious difference became a source of anger, as many Belgians felt the king's rule favored Protestant priorities over their traditions. Language was another fault line. Dutch was promoted in administration and education, even in French-speaking regions, causing frustration among southerners who saw it as imposition. On top of this, the king was determined to centralize control from The Hague, reducing the autonomy southern leaders expected. Economic divides added more tension. The southern provinces were far more industrialized than the north by the early 19th century. Textile mills, coal mining, and metal production gave them a modern factory-based economy. Yet political power and funds for infrastructure often leaned toward the northern provinces, where the king concentrated support for Dutch elites and trade interests. Many in Belgium saw this imbalance as proof they were being exploited. Their labor and industries taxed to enrich others, while their own political voice stayed limited. In August 1830, discontent flared into open rebellion. The spark came unexpectedly from an opera house in Brussels. A performance of L'Âme et Deportici ended with a rousing encore, stirring emotions that spilled into the streets as nationalist feelings surged. Crowds shouted for change, and protest turned into armed clashes. What began as a cultural event became the start of a revolution. Within days, uprisings spread across Brussels and beyond, openly defying Dutch authority and calling for independence. King William I tried to crush the movement, sending troops south, but resistance proved stronger than expected. Local fighters pushed back in cities and countryside, eventually forcing Dutch soldiers to retreat. What might have been a short revolt solidified into a broader war of separation. Meanwhile, major European powers watched closely. Both France and Britain decided an independent Belgium would serve their interests by weakening Dutch strength and stopping any one nation from growing to dominant along their borders. With this support, Belgian leaders gained international recognition faster than expected. Belgium's provisional government declared independence in 1830, setting up its own monarchy, but the Netherlands refused to accept this break. King William I held hope the southern provinces might return under his crown. Only in 1839, after long diplomacy, did the Treaty of London force Dutch recognition of Belgium's sovereignty. By then, the dream of unity had firmly collapsed. The revolution left two unusual legacies. First, few nations trace independence to an opera encore, making Belgium unique in its origin story. Second, the separation cost the Netherlands nearly 2/3 of its industrial basis, staggering economic blow. Yet this loss paradoxically made the Northern Kingdom easier to govern. No longer split by language, religion and economic rivalry, the Netherlands could focus on internal modernization and constitutional reform. What seemed a humiliation for King William I became a turning point, reshaping the Dutch state into a more stable, cohesive nation. When Belgium broke away in 1830, the Netherlands lost a large part of its industrial strength, but what remained was a smaller, more unified kingdom. Without the tension of competing languages and religious identities between North and South, the government now had a steadier platform to modernize. The economy suffered short term, yet this setback forced the country to rethink its foundations. It was no longer enough to rely only on trade and agriculture. Slowly change arrived, and by the mid-19th century industrialization began to take hold, though much slower than in neighboring Belgium or Britain. The textile industry in turn became one of the first areas of industrial growth. Traditional craft production gave way to mechanized factories where spinning machines and looms made cloth at a scale impossible for hand workers. Alongside textiles, agriculture also modernized with new tools and methods. Mechanization improved efficiency, though it pushed many rural laborers to cities seeking factory work. Step by step, the Netherlands moved from a mostly farming society toward an economy with manufacturing at its core. The transformation of Dutch cities symbolized this shift. Rotterdam grew fast as merchants and shipbuilders adapted to steam power, building docks and ports big enough for steamships. Amsterdam, with centuries of trade traditions on new railways and canals, weaved through its historic streets, connecting it to the rest of the country. Eindhoven, smaller but no less significant, emerged as an industrial town that would define Dutch industry in the coming century. Modern factories, railway stations, and bridges changed the physical shape of these cities and tied them closer to global trade networks. Infrastructure projects sped this process. The North Sea Canal, dug between 1865 and 1876, directly linked Amsterdam to the sea, letting larger cargo ships reach its harbors. For centuries, the city had been losing importance to other ports, but the canal revived its role as a commerce center. Rail lines across the country extended this effect, linking inland textile towns to coastal harbors and uniting markets once fragmented and slow to reach. The geography of the Netherlands, long shaped by water management, was now also shaped by iron tracks and steam power. Economic change brought deep social strain. Factory workers faced long hours, dangerous machines, and low pay. Cities swelled as people left the countryside, and overcrowding, poor sanitation, and poverty created unhealthy living conditions. These hardships fueled new political ideas. Socialist movements won support from workers, demanding rights, while liberal reformers pushed for more representation and less royal authority. Confessional politics focused on religious identity also stayed important among Catholics and Protestants seeking to defend their communities in the changing nation. This climate fostered polarization, or verzuiling. Dutch society split into separate pillars: Protestant, Catholic, Socialist, and Liberal, each building its own world within the same country. Each had its own newspapers, schools, trade unions, universities, and even sports clubs. People could live whole lives inside one pillar, rarely meeting those outside it. By 1900, the Netherlands was already one of Europe's most urban societies, yet paradoxically one of its most segregated because of this framework. Reforms came in time. In 1848, under liberal statesman Johan Rudolf Thorbecke, the Netherlands adopted a new constitution, firmly limiting royal power and creating a parliamentary democracy. Later, universal male suffrage came, gradually ending in 1917, giving the growing working class full political representation. This way, political structures adjusted to the social and economic pressures industrial change had unleashed. Amid these shifts, new industries defined the future. In 1891, the Philips Company was founded in Eindhoven to make light bulbs. From that small start, it grew into a global electronics giant, showing how industrial innovation would push the Netherlands into the 20th century. More broadly, industrialization reshaped society by disrupting old hierarchies and forcing the state to adapt. From harsh factory life and deep social divisions grew the movement's policies and institutions that would later build modern Dutch democracy and the welfare state. By the 19th century, the Netherlands moved from trading posts and maritime companies to direct colonial rule. Earlier ventures gave footholds across the globe, but this century marked tighter control, especially in the Dutch East Indies. What was once a network of coastal settlements and alliances became rule over whole islands and their people. By the late 1800s, millions across Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and other parts of the archipelago were under Dutch authority, along with Suriname and South America and Caribbean islands like Curaçao. Dutch power spread far beyond Europe, though the kingdom itself stayed small. The main driver of this colonial economy was the cultivation system introduced in the 1832. Under this policy, farmers in the East Indies had to use part of their land and labor to grow specific export crops. Coffee, sugar, and indigo were among goods most wanted by European markets. Products shipped out made fortunes for Dutch traders and filled government coffers, but communities producing them lived in hardship. Food shortages were common as subsistence farming fell and famine struck, when poor harvests met heavy export demand. What seemed efficient from the Netherlands was experienced as poverty and exploitation by those working the field. The impact on the Dutch homeland was immediate. Money from the colonies paid for public works, railroads, and industrial projects. Even grand buildings in Amsterdam and The Hague owed their existence to this flow of overseas wealth. The state gained so much that ordinary Dutch taxpayers paid relatively little compared to people in many other European countries. The golden edge of economic growth at home rested on the labor of people thousands of miles away with little choice. After the cultivation system ended in the 1870s, the colonial model shifted. Large private enterprise took over as plantations and mining ventures grew. Dutch investors funded estates producing tobacco, tea, rubber, and palm oil alongside operations digging tin and coal. These industries needed order and security, and the colonial government used military campaigns to crush resistance, taking more territory across the islands. The Dutch presence was no longer limited to coastal forts or trading posts, but reached deep inland, bringing more of Indonesia's people under direct rule. For many Dutch citizens, the colonial empire held symbolic weight as a mark of national pride. The East Indies, Suriname, and the Caribbean were shown as proof of Dutch strength on the world stage. Yet not everyone accepted this view. In 1860, writer Edward de Dekker published Max Havelaar under the pen name Multatuli. The novel described abuses in the Indies, pointing out corruption, forced labor, and local suffering. It struck readers in Europe and inspired a wave of criticism questioning the morality of empire. Meanwhile, in the colonies themselves, the seeds of nationalism began to sprout. By the early 20th century, educated Indonesians started organizing groups and publishing newspapers that challenged Dutch authority and demanded rights. The colonial government often answered with censorship, arrests and violent crackdowns. These measures could delay independence, but could not erase the growing awareness among Indonesians of their shared identity and political power. Despite the empire's scale, most ordinary Dutch never travelled to the colonies. Life in Java or Sumatra stayed distant, an abstraction represented by imported goods and government profits. Colonialism felt profitable but detached, yet its influence at home was huge. Between 1870 and 1930, the government consistently ran budget surpluses funded by colonial revenues. This financial cushion helped build the modern Dutch state. Though it rested on extraction and domination, abroad the paradox was clear. At home, the Netherlands became a liberal constitutional democracy, celebrated for political freedoms and cultural achievements. Abroad, in its territories, it acted as a restrictive, authoritarian power enforcing systems of labor, profit and control. The contradiction between these two faces of the same nation defined later Dutch history, and the unresolved tension would dominate the 20th century as anti-colonial movements gained strength. When World War I began in 1914, the Netherlands found itself in an extraordinary position. It was surrounded by nations in total war. Germany to the east, Belgium to the south, Britain across the North Sea. Many expected the country to be drawn in quickly, yet the Dutch stayed officially neutral through the conflict. This choice spared the Netherlands the physical ruins suffered by its neighbours. But neutrality in such a hostile environment demanded constant balancing that left lasting marks on Dutch society. The most immediate challenge was geography. Dutch land bordered Germany, and once German troops invaded Belgium, the Netherlands became the next likely target for pressure. The German government demanded concessions, pushing for use of Dutch infrastructure and resources to support their war effort. To the west, Britain kept an naval blockade meant to cut Germany off from overseas goods. That blockade also crippled Dutch trade, the lifeline of the national economy for centuries. The Netherlands walked a narrow path, refusing to let its territory be used by German armies while also dealing with British officials to prevent total isolation. Neutrality was not declared once and then left alone. It had to be defended constantly in practice. Dutch soldiers lined the borders. Railways and ports were watched closely, and customs checks tightened to stop smuggling as foreign spies used the Netherlands as a base for secret operations. Border control grew stricter than a living memory, with citizens, merchants and travellers under heavy scrutiny. The military also interned any foreign soldiers who crossed into Dutch land, whether on purpose or by accident, a requirement of international law that kept the Dutch from being accused of favouring either side. Economically, the burdens of neutrality were severe. With major ports unable to work freely due to the blockade, trade largely collapsed. Imports of essential goods fell, leaving shortages of food and raw materials. The government started rationing systems to share scarce supplies, but these were often unpopular, especially in cities. Inflation set in, eating wages and worsening hardship for the working class. The proud mercantile economy of the Netherlands, so dependent on international commerce, found itself squeezed between the demands of warring nations and the collapse of its main income. The humanitarian challenge was greater. In 1914, after Germany overran Belgium, over 1 million Belgian refugees fled north across the border seeking safety. The Netherlands, a country of only about 6 million people, then had never faced such a sudden influx. Emergency camps were built, schools and public buildings turned into shelters, and food supplies stretched even thinner. Some refugees went home as the German occupation stabilized, but many stayed through the war, changing towns and villages across the country. The presence of so many displaced people became a daily reminder that neutrality did not mean isolation from war suffering. Despite these difficulties, the Netherlands succeeded in staying outside the direct fight, a detail that still surprises many. In 1918, after Germany's defeat, Kaiser Wilhelm II fled across the border and asked for asylum in the Netherlands. The Dutch government granted it, and he lived the rest of his life in the town of Doorn. Allied leaders demanded his extradition, but the request was politely refused, showing how carefully the Dutch defended their neutrality even after the war ended. What makes this time remarkable is the scale of the balancing act. The Netherlands shared a long border with Germany, housed over 1 million refugees, endured trade collapse and yet avoided invasion. Few countries in Europe managed such a strategy. Still, neutrality came with costs. The war showed how vulnerable the Dutch economy was to outside pressures and how fragile domestic stability could become in a crisis. These lessons would echo in the years ahead, when the rise of fascism and militarism across Europe would again test whether neutrality could protect the Netherlands from the storms of war. On May 10, 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands without warning. Despite the Dutch declaration of neutrality, German forces advanced fast. For years, the Netherlands had counted on neutral status to stay out of European wars. But this time the strategy fell apart almost at once. After just 5 days of fighting, the German army forced surrender. The turning point was the bombing of Rotterdam, leveling much of the city centre and killing nearly 900 people. Faced with the threat of similar ruin in other cities, the Dutch government ordered its forces to stop. The invasion began 5 years of occupation. Life in the Netherlands changed quickly under Nazi rule. Curfews and strict censorship controlled daily routines. Newspapers and radio carried only propaganda approved by German authorities. Citizens faced forced labor, thousands sent to work in German factories or military projects. Political opponents, intellectuals and resistance members were watched closely and often arrested. The air was constant pressure, and even ordinary talk could bring suspicion or denunciation. For most people, survival meant navigating a system meant to silence opposition and exploit the country for Germany's war effort. The occupation was especially devastating for the Jewish community. Over 100,000 Dutch Jews were sent to concentration camps, including families who had lived in the Netherlands for centuries. The most widely known was Anne Frank, who hid with her family in Amsterdam for years before their capture and deportation. By war's end, fewer than 5,000 Dutch Jews survived, giving the Netherlands one of the highest death rates in Western Europe. The scale of persecution showed a grim truth. Nazi policies were enforced not just by German occupiers, but with help from some Dutch officials and police who collaborated in arrests and deportation. Resistance did exist and grew over time. Underground groups printed illegal newspapers, spread information, sabotaged infrastructure, and gave food and false papers to those in hiding. Some families risked everything to shelter Jews or escaped soldiers. Yet resistance came with high risks. Captured fighters were executed or sent to camps, and whole neighborhoods could face revenge for acts of defiance. Collaboration and resistance lived side by side, showing the moral complexity of life under occupation. By 1940, the war turned against Germany, but the Dutch still faced some of the hardest months. In the western provinces, food supplies collapsed from a German blockade and broken transport. This time remembered as the Hunger Winter caused mass starvation. Over 20,000 people died and countless others suffered long-term effects. Families relied on tulip bulbs, sugar beets, and anything they could find to survive. The crisis showed both the desperation of occupied society and the cruelty of occupation policies. The Allied tried to free the Netherlands in 1940, failed. Operation Market Garden aimed to secure bridges across the country and push deep into German defences, but it collapsed short of its goals. So northern regions stayed under German control until spring 1945. Final liberation came only on May 5, when German forces surrendered to Allied troops. Cities welcomed soldiers with celebration, but scars were everywhere. In the ruins of Rotterdam and memories of famine and in the near destruction of the Jewish community. During exile, the Dutch royal family lived in Canada. An unusual event happened in 1943 when Princess Juliana gave birth in a hospital room, temporarily declared Dutch territory to ensure her daughter's full nationality. After the war, the Netherlands briefly took small parts of German land as repayment, though most areas were later returned. In decades ahead, the memory of occupation shaped Dutch identity. From war and suffering, the Netherlands committed to democracy, to protecting human rights, and to stopping tyranny from taking root again. When World War I ended in 1945, the Netherlands faced physical ruin and deep social wounds. Yet the nation committed at once to rebuilding. Homes, bridges, railways and factories were destroyed, and much of the population had survived years of want. Reconstruction meant more than fixing buildings. It required reorganizing politics and steadying society around democracy and international cooperation. Unlike earlier centuries when the Dutch stood apart or relied on neutrality, in the post-war world they placed themselves inside larger alliances, sure that joint action would protect sovereignty and help recovery. Much early economic revival came through the Marshall Plan, an American program giving funds and materials to restart European economies. Dutch leaders used this support to modernize industry, expand social welfare and invest in infrastructure. By the late 1950s, the country had joined Western Europe's fastest-growing economies. Factories made steel, chemicals and electronics, while Rotterdam's port grew into one of the world's busiest shipping terminals. Once again, trade returned as the nervous system of the Dutch economy, though now backed by strong industry and state investment. At the same time, the Netherlands took a leading role internationally, joining new institutions defining the century's second half. It became a founding member of NATO, anchoring its security in an alliance meant to balance Soviet influence. It also joined the European Coal and Steel Community, the forerunner to today's European Union, showing long commitment to continental unity. As a charter member of the United Nations, the Netherlands won a reputation as a steady voice for law, peacekeeping and human rights. The Hague even came to host the International Court of Justice, a sign of the country's link to legal authority on the world stage. At home, the years after 1945 saw sweeping change. The welfare state grew, offering pensions, healthcare and unemployment protection that supported a stable middle class. Cities began major programs of urban renewal, replacing war-damaged areas with modern housing and infrastructure. Social change moved fast, especially in the late 20th century. Dutch society became known for tolerance and progress, with landmark policies on LGBTQ+ rights, regulated drug policy, and legally euthanasia. These choices reflected a broader cultural identity, valuing individual freedom balanced by shared responsibility. Engineering also stayed central to national survival. The North Sea flood of 1953, killing over 1,800 people, confirmed water was a greater long-term threat than any neighbor's army. In answer, the Netherlands launched the Delta Works, a huge series of dams, barriers and locks to protect the southwest from the sea. This project became one of history's largest water management systems. In the 21st century, the Dutch continued the tradition, making climate-resilient architecture, floating neighborhoods, and new ways to prevent floods. The same ingenuity that once drained marshes for farmland now placed the Netherlands as a global leader in adapting to rising seas. Modern challenges remain, and they are no simpler than those of earlier centuries. Political fragmentation and the rise of populist movements have tested the consensus model long defining Dutch politics. Immigration, integration and questions of identity shape debates across the country. Climate change demands costly adaptations to keep safe land already below sea level. The legacy of colonialism also stays present, as Suriname and Indonesian Caribbean territories continue to influence Dutch memory and policy through calls for recognition and justice. Despite such pressures, the Netherlands keeps global influence far beyond its size. It is the world's second largest agricultural exporter, possible through advanced greenhouses, crop technologies, and high-yield systems, making the most of limited land. Over a quarter of the country lies below sea level, yet it stands among the safest, driest societies on Earth. Proof of engineering shaped by centuries of struggle with water. From marshy beginnings to its place today as a hub of trade, diplomacy and innovation, the Netherlands shows repeated reinvention. Small on the map, it continues to shape the wider world in ways far beyond its borders. And so this chapter of history slowly fades into the quiet flow of time. Some mysteries remain unanswered and some truths continue to shape our world. We have walked through the past together and learned what it can teach us. If you carry this knowledge forward with you through each day, then the echoes of history will never be lost. Thank you for listening, and until next time, let the past remain alive in your mind.